Welcome to the Roadmap to 1 Million podcast. I'm your host, Stacey Zeal, and if you're looking for the high-level strategies and stories behind building a seven-figure product brand, then you're in the right place. On this show, we'll uncover the advanced strategies, stories, and secrets that you need to know in order to take your e-commerce brand to the next level. Are you ready to uncover your roadmap to 1 million? Let's dive in. Hello. Hey, y'all. Welcome to the Roadmap to 1 Million podcast. My name is Stacey, and I am super excited to talk today, y'all. We have our first guest episode today, y'all. So this is going to be awesome. We are going to talk about brand voice, if you have guessed from the title. And if you're a little unsure about what brand voice is, if you're a little unsure about whether that applies to you, you definitely want to make sure you listen because we're going to talk about all those things. But before we jump in, I want to make sure y'all have subscribed to the show. Make sure you follow it on your podcast app of choice. Make sure you share it with a friend because my goal for this year, y'all, my goal for 2023 is to give y'all all the information that you need to really take things that you're doing to the next level. And so I'm bringing on guest experts such as Sandra Kaye, who are going to talk about things that you might not necessarily hear people talking a whole lot about, but it's so important, so impactful. So I am super excited because Sandra Kaye is a brand voice strategist that also used to be a former park ranger and is writing her first children's book. So I'm super excited about these dynamic guests. So welcome to the show, Sandy. How are you?
Thank you. I am wonderful today. How are you, Stacey?
I'm good. I'm super excited. As I mentioned, like I feel like I always say I'm super excited on my podcast, but it's because I really am. Because when I get to recording, especially if I have a guest that like you that is going to talk about something that I think is just such an important topic for our brands out there to learn about, and something that is just something that is not talked about. Like the goal of this show when I started it was really to be able to unveil some of the secrets and some of the strategies that people who are just starting out or people who have not worked behind a brand like a Zappos or some of these big brands that you just wouldn't know. And because I worked in that kind of environment where you have a lot of moving pieces, you have a lot of players that are working on the marketing team or that are working to, advance the brand, that how do you keep it that voice? How do you make sure that you have that consistent voice? So we're going to talk about all that. But before we jump into that, I would love for you to give us a little bit about your journey, talk about how you've gone from park ranger, which I think is freaking fantastic. And that's awesome. From park ranger to brand voice strategist.
Yeah, it's quite an unusual journey. That's for sure. Most people do it the opposite way, right? Like they start in something and say, but I've always wanted to be a park ranger. And then they eventually move into their dream job. And mine was a little bit of a flip journey. So I went to school for biology. I got my master's degree in communications, all for this big grand idea of being a park ranger for my entire career. It was something that was embedded in me as a kid. In high school, I kind of pretty much always knew what I wanted to do from maybe ninth grade on, and got into some really cool programs and eventually found my way into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a park ranger. So really set myself up there with a fantastic career, got to see some wonderful things. I've, of course, got some really wonky stories from Florida panthers to manatees to anything in between. But let's see, would have been in 2009. I had my first kid, and his name is Preston, and he just loved coming with me. He would help me in the visitor center. He'd do tours with me. I mean, he was just so much fun to have along on the journey of my career. And I just kept thinking, like, this is so awesome. I'm going to be like that mom, that cool mom, right? That, has her kids out tromping around in the woods and, doing these cool things for conservation. My second child, also a boy, Jack, was born in 2013, but unfortunately he was born with a rare spine disorder. And so it was decided after, some heartache for me to leave my career so that I could take care of all of his needs. He had a lot of needs, complex surgeries for a number of years. And I always say it was the easiest decision. It was the hardest decision at the same time to leave that career. It was what I had grown up wanting to do. So, when I talk to anybody about whether it's copywriting or brand voice or running your own business, the more skills you have, the better. I'm also one of those people that likes to promote, like, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Because there was definitely a lot of personal journey for me in accepting that I was no longer going to be a park ranger, that part of my identity. And so as I kind of looked out of the black hole I'd gotten myself into for taking care of Jack, I looked around and went like, okay, so park ranger isn't possible anymore, but look at all these skills that I had as a park ranger, right? I've got public speaking, I've got PR, I've got writing skills. I can do planning. I can do a lot of community work. I mean, most of my job was actually pulling together partnerships and bringing in funding, even though I wasn't allowed to bring in funding myself personally as a federal employee. There was a lot of involvement in bringing groups together for funding for projects that we had. I got to work with lots of really cool organizations, NASA to be one, and got to do some really neat things with nonprofits and community organizations. And so as I was kind of looking around at like, what's the second part of my life here? Something that I can do on my own time, something that is flexible with all these doctor's appointments, something that gives me a little bit of purpose that I feel like I'm still contributing to the world. And so I just started copywriting, to be honest. I actually started as a VA. I started doing VA work for a couple of years. And that was easy work to do at doctor's appointments, at hospitals, and, surgery waiting rooms, right? Like it's just, a whole bunch of easy tasks you can check off the box in 15 minutes. And that supported me for quite a while. I was very thankful for the businesses I worked with there in those first couple of years, because they were so patient and wonderful with me and giving me things that I could do. And from there, it was just like copywriting, I just wanted to write. I wanted to speak. I wanted to be with people again, even if it was remotely. And so copywriting kind of became my thing. And that eventually ended up leading into Brand Voice. And that's a whole nother story for why I picked that, but that's kind of the general backstory.
Yeah, I love that. I love hearing other entrepreneurs' journeys, because I have a similar journey in the sense of finding different things to pivot into and figuring out, like, you're starting with one thing and then you're like, okay, well, now I need to pivot for whatever reason, or I need to change, or whether it's, personal, whether it's family, whatever it is. I've had so many pivots in my career, and I always tell people that all of the skills that you acquire over your journey all add up, right? Like when I've been in marketing for 11 years. And so I have all those marketing skills, but then like I was a makeup artist, at one point, and I really learned how to do my face, how to do other people's faces, and then realized I didn't really want to do this anymore. I didn't like to be that close to people, like physically,
Right.
So I didn't want to do that. And so I always thought I had started to think like, oh, like, I wasted time doing this, because I had done that for a couple of years. But now it's like, if I need to go on stage, if I need to go, be on a presentation, if I need to do something, I always know that I'll make my makeup is going to look great, right? Whether I'm on camera, I can change it for if I'm on camera, I can change it for if I'm in, out in public, and, those kinds of things. And so I always like to tell people, like, follow your curiosities, because that's, sounds like it's similar, like got to your journey. You're like, you started out with copywriting, got into your park ranger, acquired all of those skills, and then moved that into something completely different that built upon, that you've built upon what your business is built upon now. And so I love that whole journey. Hey, are you doing all the things when you'd rather be CEOing? What if instead of doing all the things like figuring out the marketing strategy and leading the team, you could free up your time to focus on other areas of your business that really need your attention? That's possible when you work with my team at Stacey Zeal & Co. We are strategic marketing partners for e-commerce brands that want to take their sales and impact to the next level. Ready to stop playing small and do what it takes to become a big-ass impactful brand? Head over to roadmap-to-1million.com to book a call with me. Don't wait. Now. Right now is your time. Head over to roadmap-to-1million.com to book a call with me. I look forward to helping you get to your next level. And so let's talk about, we've been mentioning brand voice. I want to make sure that our entrepreneurs out there understand exactly what we're talking about, because we know what we're talking about and we could geek out on it. But let's start with, what is brand voice, and why is it important for our CEOs out there to think about for 2023?
So yes, brand voice is one of those things that everyone thinks they know, but it's really just kind of like a surface knowledge. And so the way I like to start out the conversation is by actually getting into books, characters, and this is really how I started with my brand voice journey. If you think about characters, whether it's in books or in TV shows or movies, cartoons, any of that kind of stuff, each of them has a voice, and each of us has a voice. And brand voice isn't entirely different from that. But for some reason, it's been concisely drawn down to just like tone. And like brand voice is all about tone. And if you told a person that, it's not just about the tone of voice you're using, it's how fast you talk or write. It's the cadence, the rhythm of how you do it. Ross on Friends just made it famous. So did Chandler, right? Like, those different emphasis on words that they put. And all of that leads into what makes up a voice, as well as background and character, personality, all that kind of stuff. And so it's not as drilled down as people like to think it is in the business world. It is still pretty complicated. So the way I like to think about it is tone is definitely a big part of it. So tone is the feelings of the person or the brand. So if you talk about the tone of a company, that's not just one word. It's not just 5 words even. It depends a little bit on the circumstance. It depends on where they are in their journey as a company. Are they, new? Have they been around for 100 years? The emotions that brand evokes is the tone. And I don't like to just bring that down to, 3 tone words and, a couple of phrases, which is in a lot of branding guides, because it definitely changes. Something like the pandemic, really brought that forward. Companies had no idea how to react to that. And so we need to make sure that we have a documentation of what our tone is during times of crisis, also in times of celebration, right? When there's something really cool going on in the world or in your company. But obviously brand voice is a lot more than that. It's also the rhythm, the cadence of how you write and how you sound. And so what I like to direct people to in this instance is on social media, especially, it kind of became a thing on Facebook, but you see it everywhere now. When somebody writes out and they have 1 sentence per line, and then there's a line break, and then there's another sentence and a line break. And it became popular a few years ago during the pandemic, especially, and it makes for a very long post. It's broken up. It's very short rhythm. Other people will write in paragraphs, like we learned in junior high and high school, right? Like, a paragraph has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And they'll have long, flowy sentences. They'll use lots of commas, maybe. They'll use lots of parenthetical asides, which is what I do. I am a lover of parenthetical asides, which is, you put things in parentheses to further explain your point. Mm-hmm. So my sentences tend to be pretty long, have a lot of parentheses in them. I use a lot of commas. And then sometimes I'll break it up with like a short sentence in between. And then the last part of voice, besides tone and cadence, is vocabulary. And this is the words that you use, it's the complexity of the words that you use as well. We like to refer to it as grade level. So, a lot of times you'll see, especially if you use Grammarly when you're writing in Google Docs or in Microsoft Word or something, and you use Grammarly, it might tell you that you're writing at a grade 3 or a grade 10. And everybody always says, write at a grade 4, try and aim for a grade 4. That's great if your audience is at a grade 4. Mm-hmm. And if you were at a grade 4. Mm-hmm. But I'm telling you, if you're a cancer researcher and you're talking to other cancer researchers, you do not want to talk at a grade 4. Right. Yeah. Right. You'll be shunned. Is it like, oh, that person doesn't know what she's talking about? So your vocabulary, the complexity, the length of the words, and what your audience does and doesn't know that you have to explain within your sentences, as well as your jargon, your industry jargon, your personal jargon, abbreviations that are common. All those kinds of things inform your voice and how you sound.
I love that explanation because it really gives us an idea of like that one, your brand voice is more complex than you think it is. And the reason I think that it is so important is for, for CEOs out there, one of the things I have been talking about on the podcast recently is finding ways to remove yourself from having to be the center of your business or being the center of your marketing. And I think one of the great ways that you can do that is by equipping your team with the necessary, brand voice guidelines that they need to be able to either write captions for you on your social media pages, write blog posts for you if you go that route, or being able to just have someone do more of the content creation, because we know how important content creation is and all that. But you also want to make sure that your brand is aligned, that the voice sounds the same, that regardless of whether, for example, for me, I have my assistant writes my show notes. Right. And so if she writes the show notes, we need to make sure that we sound similar, because I talk very fast. I also, very so I can see when you were talking about your jargon or the vocabulary that you use, the tone, the rhythm, or the cadence, how fast, all that stuff definitely matters, especially if you as a CEO, if your brand is kind of being built around you, because all of our brands have a piece of us in it, right? And all that. But if you're thinking about scalability and you're thinking about adding more people to your team, you're thinking about either having an agency that may come in and handle some stuff for you, you're thinking about your Facebook ad copy, all that kind of stuff, all the different places that you need copy. If that's not your strong suit, or even if it is your strong suit, but it's a place that you don't want to necessarily be the bottleneck for because you have so many other things going on, I think that's one of the great things about having a brand voice guideline.
Yes, so, and I don't know how many times I've heard somebody, tell me that they hired somebody to write their emails, for example, and then they'll get a phone call or a text message from a friend and say, "Oh, I read this week's newsletter. You must have a new writer." And that's the most awful thing possible, because you want them to say, "Hey, I saw your newsletter, great one," and then ask a question, or, "You're really doing this," or something. The fact that somebody could tell that it wasn't her is not good.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's that could be maybe one of a signal to some of our CEOs out there is are you noticing that people are noticing, or that your audience is noticing, when it sounds like it's coming from you, the CEO, or when it sounds like it's coming from your, your marketing person, or when it's coming from your agency, right? Have you started to notice those things? But what are some, when should we as CEOs thinking about brand voice, when should we start to prioritize brand voice? Because I'm most of the people who listen to our podcast, or our podcast, is really for people who have been in business, whether that's, they've started to, really generate some revenue, they're starting to get some momentum, and they're really trying to get to the next level. They're not just starting out. So there's, maybe there's people who are just starting out who can really get the nuggets. But speaking to that crowd of CEO who, you have your business, you're selling some products, you're getting some momentum, you're making it, you're starting to get some consistent revenue, or maybe you have consistent revenue, you want to get to that next level. When should they be considering, prioritizing their brand voice?
That's such a great question, because I see too many people start to worry about things too early. Mm-hmm. And it's so common, especially in the online space. And so one of the things that I say is that, and your audience probably already has these in place, or they're very close to it. You need to know exactly who you are and who you aren't, right? There's no more experimentation around what you offer, or no throwing spaghetti at what your product is or your service. You've figured that out. It's proven. You've sold it, and you want to sell more of it. So that is the biggest part of it, is that you have this stuff already figured out and you just want to do more of it. You want to sell more of it. That's when you can start to think about brand voice. Usually around the time also that you're starting to think about marketing on a bigger scale is when you're ready to start thinking about brand voice. So if you're ready to start thinking about hiring specialists for whether it's ads, right, or you're trying to hire a marketing agency to hand this stuff over to, that's another good clue that you're ready for brand voice strategy. And the reason I say that is because it's so important to document your brand voice so that other people can mirror it and take it forward without you, right? So that you can stop being that bottleneck that you referred to. And so as long as you've got a proven product and you know who you are and who you aren't, you also have a good differentiation for what separates you from your competitors. And you've also got content out there, right? Like there's nothing for me to, if I can't analyze something, there's nothing for me to document either. So, you need to have content out there, whether it's an email list or a blog or social media posts, or podcast show notes, or for a lot of businesses that maybe aren't online yet, or they came online because of the pandemic. And a lot of times there's a misfiring between the brand voice that they were using before and the brand voice that they've been experimenting with. So they have the proven product, and they had that for a long time, but were forced to go online during the pandemic, and things are still a little wonky. And that's another time where it can be a time to think about brand voice, is realigning everything and taking a look at your old brochures and your old flyers, and the stuff that you use for in-person networking, presentation slides, all that kind of stuff that goes into brand voice collectively.
Yeah. That is such great tips. I love when you mentioned that you're in a place where you're starting to hire specialists, because that's really when you know that you're in a place that you're ready to scale, is when, let's say you as a CEO, you have a marketing, assistant or a marketing coordinator that's helping you with posting on social, sending out the emails, doing all the executor things. If you want to learn more about like having strategists on your team versus executors, or when you should hire an agency or whether you should do things in-house, take a look at some podcasts, some episodes back, because I definitely talked about those things if you want to dive into that a little bit more. But one of the things I mentioned when I talk about having, thinking about your team, is that you need executors on your marketing team. And until you get a strategist on your team, the CEO is the strategist. And so if you're at a place where you're like, I am the CEO, I am, I'm leading my business, I have a team, and I need to bring someone on who is a strategist, or I need to have someone who is a specialist in, let's say, email marketing, because your email marketing is making you a lot of money and you really want to bring someone in who can do it, who can do it really well, or you want to bring in an agency that can take all of that off of your plate because maybe you're doing a high volume of email. That is a signal for you that you need to start to really tighten up your brand voice, because what's going to happen is, like, as Sandy was saying, is that what's going to happen is you're really going to start to, have all your customers having a different experience based on wherever they come in contact with you first.
Exactly.
So, like, who come into contact with me first, for example, come in contact with me on my podcast first, and then they go over to my blog and I'm using words that I've never used in my podcast, or it sounds like it's from a man's perspective, or anything like that, or it doesn't have, my Stacey isms that I do, or any of those kinds of things, right? If you don't, start to document those things, you're really going to start to create different experiences for your customers. And a confused customer is not someone who's going to buy from you, right? Or a confused leader is not going to buy. They want to make sure that the whole experience I get, from what my ads look like, what the copy says, to the landing page, to, the webinar that you do, or to the product descriptions that you have on your site, like, all of that stuff leads customers further to a sale. And if anywhere in that journey people get confused, like if they're reading copy that sounds like it's from you and sounds like it's from somebody else, and people are using jargon over here, or you're trying to mimic a certain language that you don't actually speak, right? So all of that stuff are things that your customers may not necessarily specifically say to you, your brand voice is jacked up and that's why I didn't buy. But those are kinds of things that you can kind of hit on to make it easier and make that path to sale a lot smoother.
Right. And people, you're right. Exactly. People are not going to say, oh, I didn't buy because your brand voice, didn't match up. Yeah. They're going to use much different terminology than that. But that's what it comes down to. And I like to talk about it in reference of driving in a stick shift. And so let's say you're driving with an inexperienced driver, somebody who's learning how to drive a stick shift. Does anybody drive stick shifts anymore? This is a great relevant.
I've never learned how to drive a stick shift ever, but I have a great
story from 20 years ago. But if you think about a stick shift and driving, and you're going along smoothly, and then all of a sudden they try and shift and you get jerked in the car, right? And so then they try and shift again, jerk again. And then let's add like some poorly maintained roads, got potholes, and then like all of a sudden you're in a neighborhood, and so you've got the stick shift and the potholes and the bumps, the road bumps to slow you down, and then there's a few stop signs in there as well. And so every time your brand voice isn't aligned, that's one of those, potholes or bumps in the road that you hit. And so by the time you get to your destination, everybody's they're tired, they're ready to get out of the car. And it's just like, everybody's complaining about it. Like, that was the worst car ride ever. I feel like puking.
Right.
Right.
I get car sick, so I understand, literally.
Like, I don't ever put me in that car with that person again.
Exactly.
Those people are not going to be happy when they get out of that experience. They want to get away as fast as possible.
Yeah.
But if you've got an automatic car and you're driving on newly paved streets, they've taken the stop signs down, everything is well maintained, you're there in 3 minutes, you got in the car and you drove smoothly, you didn't even have time to even process the journey, you're there before you even knew it. There was no hiccup that came into play for you. And so those are the people who get like all the way to the end of your funnel and they click the buy button. But it's like the candy bar at the grocery store, right? They click the buy button because it was so easy and so aligned with who they are, and there was no hiccups for them. And so, if you are a person who doesn't swear, and suddenly in one of your journeys for your customers, you drop, a swear word, you're going to cause your audience to jerk suddenly and be like, whoa, wait a minute. Am I in the right place? I'm on Stacy's, like the Stacy, and then they go back and check. And those are things you don't want to have happen. You do not want people to suddenly question where they are in your journey or whose journey they're on.
Yeah, that's money right there. Like, you don't want people to question whose journey they're on, right? Like you want people to make sure that when they're reading anything that you're sending out, they know it's coming from you, and they know, yes. and people, because people buy into a brand, right? They're buying into the story of the brand. They're buying into the voice is a part of that story. Like, the way you communicate your story is so important, and it has to sound authentic. It has to, really connect with your customers. But at the end of the day, like, people connect to brands, especially like if you're thinking about like, not if you have a personal brand, but you're thinking about an actual company. Like, I think about Zappos, like there were people who are very, very connected to the brand. Like, people very much believed in the brand, like, and when we're creating copy, you're creating content and all those kinds of things, it has to be zappy. Like, that's the voice. Zappos is not a very serious brand. Like, if they were to come out and post something where they sounded like they were Amazon, for example, because Amazon has a very, more serious kind of voice, yes, than Zappos. And so even though Zappos is owned by Amazon, they have different right? Like, completely different voices, completely different approaches. And even the way that they run their businesses are very different. And it all fits into the culture that, of that brand. So like the culture, the brand voice, all of these kinds of things, if you're thinking about becoming a big brand, because that's what I want my audience, people who listen to this podcast, they have a big vision. Like, I want to tell y'all the things that you need to know to become very big, not to just be like, oh, well, I make, 6 figures a year and that's it, right? Like, 6 figures is great. But if you really want to change lives and you really want to get to that next level, you have to be aiming for at least 1 million. And so I want y'all to understand that these are the kinds of things that matter along your journey as you're scaling. And so let's talk about, give a little bit more context. Let's talk about some brands or some examples of brands that does this very, very well.
Yes. So, if there's anybody who grew up in our generation, they were growing up in the 80s, there's lots of really wonderful examples of companies who were kind of going head to head in the 80s. Nothing better than Coke and Pepsi. Right? You either drink Coke or you drink Pepsi. And boy, when a restaurant doesn't have your drink, it's like meltdown. It's like temper tantrum. Like, I'm not going to eat at that restaurant because they have Coke products and I need my Pepsi. And so it's not just brand loyalty to the Coke or Pepsi thing. It also extends out to the restaurants and what they serve, or what gas stations you stop at, because they have your Coke or your Pepsi. And so if you take a look at some of the brand voices within those, the advertising that they did, beer in the 80s was the same thing, right? Budweiser. Their brand voice became the frogs in the 80s and 90s, right? Budweiser. So, all these things that these brands do create this identity. It's not just the brand voice. It's so much. It's the culture of the company. It's the identity of the company, and it's the loyalty of the company as well. So I like to compare things like Patagonia If you're somebody who likes outdoor clothing and outdoor experiences, Patagonia is much different than Eddie Bauer, right? Patagonia is out there. Their brand voice has a lot of social context to it, social justice. They are very aware of where their products come from, and they want to try and become as sustainable as possible. I'm sure Eddie Bauer probably has those that in, as part of their company as well, but it's not in their brand voice so much. Their brand voice is much more about longevity. You're going to have this coat for 100 years. It's going to be handed down to your grandson. It's going to get you through all of these experiences, right? Like you're going to go camping in these harsh conditions and it's going to last. It's going to protect you. So their brand voice is much more like a parent than Patagonia, which is kind of like along for the ride with you in a certain way. Same with, if you think about ice cream and you think about Breyers and Ben & Jerry's. Right? The differentiation between the voices that you hear, Ford and Tesla. I mean, come on, Ford their brand voice is very male for one thing, right? Although a lot of females love Ford, including me. But it definitely has that tough aspect to it. Will get you through anything. You can take this into the woods, you can go camping, you can go up these mountains. It's definitely in the toughness factor, and a little bit in the longevity factor. Like a lot of their commercials especially are, your grandpa had a Ford and your dad had a Ford, and now you're going to have a Ford, and all that stuff is built in. Tesla, though, is much different. They're not thinking about longevity yet. Maybe they will. Maybe their brand voice will change over time, but they are about attracting, and they are, as a company, their brand voice is much more about innovation and what's new, what can we try, what's next. And so they want to attract the kind of people who maybe they're a little bit more risk takers than hopping into, like a Ford sedan. But they're also, they're much more on edge, right? Like culturally, their voice is much more aware of what's going on in society, where Ford is looking back, Tesla is looking forward in their brand voice.
Yeah, those are such great examples. I think that, anyone who is building a consumer brand definitely needs to look into those examples. So let me give them to y'all again. So just in case you want to find one that resonates with you, it's Coke and Pepsi. Great example. Patagonia and Eddie Bauer, also a great example for more like if you're more of a clothing brand. Ben & Jerry's versus Breyer, if you're, more like a CPG kind of brand. One brand that sticks out to me that has an amazing brand voice is Fenty Beauty, which is Rihanna's makeup line. And not just because I love Fenty, because I do love my Fenty products, but I love their voice because, and it's one thing that I feel like I actually noticed it as like a marketer. I remember following them on Twitter when they first were getting started. And you can just tell by the way that they even tweet that they are very, very much tapped into their community. Like they use the same language that we use. They describe the same kind of looks that we do on our makeup, the same kind of way that we describe them. They speak very much to a millennial, multicultural kind of person, where you care about having a diverse range of foundations, and you care about having all these different products, but it also is Rihanna's voice, right? But if you think about even Rihanna's voice and Fenty's voice, they are different, right? Even though it's owned by the same person, Rihanna's voice is a lot more edgy. It's a lot more, not in your face, but it's a lot more like chill, laid back, but also edgy. Fenty is not really. Fenty speaks to more of a millennial audience, more of a, someone who could be very edgy with their makeup, but also could just wear, want to just be on camera for Zoom for work. And you could just put that on, right? But it matches your skin and that kind of thing. So when you're thinking about taking your brand to the next level, and you're thinking about all the things that you want to be known for, or that you want to make a staple in, like those are some kinds of things that I think that, especially like if you, when you're starting your own business, that's kind of the fun part. Like you get to create your own brand voice. Like you get to create your own character. I mean, you think about the Geico Gecko, right? Like, Geico even has different kind of characters, but they all kind of fit within Geico, right? Like it's not completely out of the ordinary. Or even like if you think about Old Spice, like Old Spice uses the same guy or the same kind of voice, And so think about like when you're scaling, I challenge our listeners that if you're thinking about as 2023 as the year that you really take your business to the next level, you really want to make a staple in the industry that you're in, really start to consider, like, how can you make sure that as you scale, as you expand, your voice and your brand still remains intact, right? It still resonates with its core customer. It still resonates with who you're trying to attract, but it also still feels authentic to you. And it feels like something that you definitely have given birth to, and give it, and allowing your people to maybe, input and help it to become what it is, right? Because we can't just do it ourselves. It's not our voice, the CEO, but
Right.
it's a collective voice, but it does come from us. And so I think that we have just had such an amazing conversation about brand voice. And so I want to make sure that everyone who wants to work on their brand voice, make sure y'all talk to Sandy. So Sandy, let us know how people can work with you and where we can get in touch with you if we want to learn more.
Absolutely. I am online at sandrakaywrites.com. K is Kaye, by the way. It's an unusual spelling, but Sandra Kaye, Writes, WRITES.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn at Sandra Kaye. And I post pretty frequently on LinkedIn about brand voice, but also other things, running a business and being an entrepreneur and that kind of thing. So those are the two primary ways that you can reach me. The way to work with me, I do copywriting. So if you are somebody who is still exploring your brand voice a little bit, isn't quite sure what it is, or you want to find it, I can help with some copywriting and try and bring that in for you, whether it's one project or on an ongoing basis. But the primary way to work with me is through brand voice guides, of course, where I document and give your team the guidelines for how to sound like you. And you have such an important point there, which is the difference between talking as the CEO of the company and talking as the company. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I outline in some of my brand voice guides is, if you're talking about the company as a whole, and like, this is, we're selling this new thing, or we love to do this, but then something happens and the CEO wants to come out and say, like, by the way, I want to respond to an industry trend, or I want to respond to a catastrophe or a celebration. That's one of the things that I enjoy outlining the most, is the difference between the two. So that's what really takes your brand forward. If you're really wanting to elevate in 2023, separating yourself from the brand's voice is such a key and fun part of that, because you also get to see what your team can bring to it. And, I always like to say that the brand voice starts out 100% you, and then we get your team involved, and they say, well, that's what she thinks is happening, but what's really happening?
I love that.
And I hear that so much. So it ends up being 80% of the CEO and 20, maybe 30% of what the team, has laid out. And that's such an important point, because obviously you don't want to exclude your team from the process or from participating in your brand's voice. And they do have a handle on it on a day-to-day, basis that you don't typically. So a lot of things that we can hash out in there.
I love that. Love that, y'all. So definitely make sure that y'all check out Sandy's website. All of her links will be in our show notes as well. So just scroll on down, make sure to link to her site, link to the LinkedIn page, and all that kind of good stuff. Well, thank you so much for coming on, because again, this has been such a great conversation. This is such a great episode to kick off the year for our CEOs out there. So thank you again, and we will see y'all on the next episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Roadmap to 1 Million podcast. I just know you got a nugget or two from that episode that will take your brand to the next level if you take action. Keyword, take action. So head over to stacyzeal.co/checklist to get a free resource that will help you to take action on what you learned today, so that you can get on to building the brand of your dreams. And be sure to leave us a review so businesses like yours can get this gold as well. All right, y'all. I'll see you on the next episode.